historical text, 600 pages. He was a professional historian. And he explains how Methodism was very important for the birth of English socialism, the critique of a class-ridden society. The Anglicans were quite happy because they were normally on the top of the tree socially. The Queen or the King was the top Anglican, and then all the, lords and ladies all jostled to be important, and the bishops went round with their posh clothes and lived in fancy palaces, The Methodists, as I say, were more from lower class, middle class backgrounds. They just wanted to get equal to God. They didn't want to be, like Christ himself said, who wants to be first has to be a servant. And he used to go around washing the feet of his disciples to make that point. He wasn't trying to institute a sort of social hierarchy. He was more trying to institute an egalitarian community. So the Methodists would say they were being faithful to that. And E.P. Thompson's book shows how the Methodists were very active in the formation of the British Labour Party. So the left. A lot of these people were Christian socialists who thought you can combine Christ's teachings with socialist reform of society. So the rich aren't too rich and the poor aren't too poor, which I still think is a good idea myself. And, the British would be wise to remember that at the next election. Okay, so the next one we come to is number 50, which is an interesting one. It's called Rosicrucians. And I'm going to refer people to my Dictionary of Gnosis and Western Esotericism, which has a brilliant entry on Rosicrucianism. It was a movement coming up in the 17th century Christianity. The word Rosicrucian means a rosy cross, and the image is of a cross with a rose on it. And this was a visual image that appeared in print and art in the early 1600s all over Europe. And they published these mysterious manifestos, suddenly appeared in print in Paris and Amsterdam and places. The Rosicrucian manifestos, which announced there was this thing called the Secret Society of Rosicrucians, who were going to reform society. And one of them was called the Allgemeine und Generalreformation der ganzen weiten Welt, German for the Universal and General Reformation of the whole wide world, and the Fama Fraternatis, the fame of the fraternity of the praiseworthy Order of the Rose Cross, written to all the learned and the rulers of Europe. Now these were anonymous tracts that appeared. And basically they announced that it was time for a whole new world order. The old world was corrupt, too much jostling between the rich and the poor, and the rulers were corrupt. It was time we had a whole new reformation of universalism, which was based on spiritual wisdom. The Rosicrucians looked to the ancient Hermetic writings of Egypt, the occult writings that we've talked about previously when we looked at some of the esoteric traditions. And they shook European consciousness because, what if there really is this thing, Rosicrucian secret order, and they've handed down these ancient mysteries from ancient times, and they could be, like, in my town, and I didn't know it, then isn't that important? Shouldn't I, listen to them? Wouldn't they be able to give me some teaching that I might need? I mean, maybe the Christianity I've been following, if I'm a loyal Anglican or Catholic or something, is only skin deep. What if these guys have gone down to the deep wells of wisdom? And that then became quite exciting to people. People all started looking for the Rosicrucians, obviously. And Leibniz, the great Christian philosopher, he is rumoured to have met one in the mid-1600s, and even to have worked in one of their libraries for a time. think in Leipzig or somewhere in Germany. And there are all kind of rumours about spotting a Rosicrucian. You know, how can you know if one is one? I mean, I could be, for all you know. Well, and therefore scholars have gone to town on like tracking them down. It's a big thing to be an expert in Rosicrucian history. One of my favourite scholars who tried this is Dame Elizabeth Yates, an English woman historian of esoteric Christianity. She worked at the Warburg Institute at the University of London, near where I founded my institute. And she wrote a book called The Rosicrucian Enlightenment. And she argued that out of this Rosicrucian thing emerged the Enlightenment in European history. You know, which made possible later Christian philosophers like Kant and Hegel and Francis Bacon and all the rest of them. She argues that John Dee, the Magus of Queen Elizabeth, was like a proto-Rosicrucian, and that so was Francis Bacon, the English philosopher and Christian thinker, who likewise called for a universal reformation, which ended up in becoming the scientific method. And so Yates argues that those Anglican esotericists around Dee and Bacon and their circle planted the seeds of Rosicrucianism around Europe and sent tracts to Holland and Germany and said, look, come on lads, let's all get a universal reformation going. And it doesn't matter if you're a Catholic or a Protestant, you can join us, we're just wisdom workers. Right? And then they invented this myth, according to Yates, of Christian Rosenkreuz. Christian Rosenkreuz, who's supposed to have been a real person. He died in 1484 at the age of 106, according to the texts. And the tradition is that sometime after his death, some people had gone into the place where he was buried, a kind of like a a tomb, but you could walk into it, a proper cave type thing. And they found his body still perfect, shining with light, like 100 years afterwards, and that he was the founder of the Rosicrucians, who'd been to the East and brought back secret books. He'd been to Damascus and Sufi places, brought back esoteric wisdom from Egypt and the Islamic Sufi world. And then he had founded the Rosicrucian order in like 1400 or something, and initiated certain people. So it's a bit like Freemasonry. It's early form of Freemasonry, and there are Freemasonic groups that say the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons go back to a common origin. There are several big Rosicrucian organisations still active now. One of the biggest is AMORC, which is headquartered in the States. I was once invited to give a lecture at their annual conference in the Dutch Antilles, somewhere in the West Indies. And I was really looking forward to it. At the last minute it was cancelled. I don't quite know why. They just didn't have it. It's a shame. I would have met thousands of Rosicrucians. And I was going to give them a lecture, but maybe another time. So there are still lots of Rosicrucians about. And that group believed that, yes, Christian Rosenkreuz was real. He did, found it, but it was based on earlier traditions, maybe Sufist traditions, which ultimately went back to ancient Egypt. The founder of the Rosicrucians in 20th century America, this AMORC thing, says that it went back to went back ultimately to Egyptian sources. The AMORC stands for the Ancient and Mystical Order Rosae Crucis, founded by Harvey Spencer Lewis, who lived between 1883 and 1939. He was from New York and a member of the Society of Psychical Research in New York. They've been going ever since 1917. Now, there are other people, possibly Francis Yates and others, who would say no, that there wasn't actually a Christian Rosenkreuz. It's a myth that was used to generate the idea that there might have been. even the idea that there might have been a secret order is very exciting. So we'll have to recreate it, you know. I suspend judgment. I don't know. I've never met Christian Rosenkreuz in any world that I'm aware of. But I love the story. Jakob Böhme, a great German philosopher, also talked about Rosicrucian ideas. And the good news is really this form of Christianity is it's a mixture of intellectual, so you have to be pretty clever to understand this stuff, but it's also spiritual, and it changes the heart of someone, so you have to be quite feeling as well. And the image of the rose on the cross is that Christ didn't come to bring suffering to the world. This idea of Christ, you know, being crucified, which is in most churches in the world, it's a bit gruesome. And if you take a child in there, you say, "Mummy, what's that person doing stuck on a cross?" You know, like, why do we have to use that image as what Christianity stands for? Like, do we stand for sadism and torture and human sacrifice? I mean, what's that about? So no, by putting a rose on the cross, what they're saying is actually this church stands for love, because the rose is a symbol of love. And it was a symbol of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. So the Rosicrucians would say they're trying to balance the kind of the fear and gruesome killing and torture and murder and so on that Christianity sometimes arises in people. If they think they're fighting the last battle against demons, then they'll do anything. Right? Whereas by putting a rose on the cross, what you're saying is, look, calm down, it's all a love story. It's all a love story, just get with the message. You know. So, I mean, personally, I'd much rather go into a church and see a rose on the cross than a crucified Jesus. Okay, so that's the Rosicrucians. Now, next one. So, have I done... Let's have a look, sorry. Yes, the next one is the Baptists. Well, we sort of looked at them. 57. I did kind of talk about the Baptists, who were a Protestant group at the time of the Reformation, who were even more extreme than Luther, in that they felt that you had to be baptized again. If you'd have been baptized a Catholic as a baby, as most Catholic babies are, that didn't count, because it was just a bit of water sprinkled by your parents' command to the priest. No, if you were going to be baptized, it had to be as an adult, when you were fully conscious, aware of what you were doing, and made a commitment to Christ to follow his footsteps. And they normally insist on, in those days, a full immersion. So you have to go down into like a mini swimming pool tank, not just a bit of water on the forehead, or into a river or a lake. And they said the other baptism doesn't count. Now that, of course, really annoyed the Catholics, who had all had the other baptism as children. And it was rather offensive to them, because they were being told they weren't going to go to heaven. Because these Christians believe that the baptism is what gets you into heaven, as long as you don't break any more serious rules after that. Because it washes away all the sins you've done up to then. So to be told suddenly by these Baptists that you're sorry, that doesn't work, that baptism you had, you've got to be baptized again, that was trouble. And so it caused wars, of course, because human beings seem to default to violence. Whenever there's a chance of doing some intellectual work, they choose to fight it out on the battlefield. So the Baptists, unfortunately, fought the Catholics in many gruesome wars, and normally the Protestants lost, but not always. In Switzerland, they sort of won, because they managed to get Switzerland as a little haven for Protestants. And in Britain, they kind of won. But, what's winning and losing in these matters? I think they're all rather silly. Okay, that's the Baptists. Oh, and my ancestors were Baptists, going back to the 1600s. I have a family tree of Cloughs on my mother's side who were all Baptists, so they believed in this stuff. And I myself was baptized later as an adult, so they'd be quite happy about that, probably. And they were, Thomas Muntzer was probably one of the most famous. He's in my book of Thomases. Thomas Muntzer was a Baptist proto-communist who wanted to change Munster into a communist-type paradise, where there'd be no lords, masters taxing you, there'd be no poor, everyone would like live equally. And it lasted for about a year before the Catholic army came and shut it down and burnt him alive. Because it was seen as a double heresy. It was a political and social attack on the status quo, and it was also a religious attack on the status quo. So poor old Thomas Munzer got it big time. And he was a hero, of course, of the German communist tradition. Engels loved him. And the German communists all looked back on Thomas Munzer as their founder. And, what I've discovered about the origin of communism is it's much deeper than Marxism. And it goes back to a spiritual stand against spiritual corruption. And in that sense, Thomas Munzer was a great example of a Baptist. And I think those people deserve their place in history. And the silliness of the anti-communist right wing, which we've seen flourishing in Hitlerism and all that, the extreme right wing, which has been, partly Republicans and Tories always are anti-communist. They don't know what they're talking about because they're not aware of this deeper spiritual source of communism and its spiritual roots, which Pierre Leroux, my local French intellectual here in Boussac, was aware of. He was a spiritual communist, as was Thomas Munzer. So we need a much more mature conversation about all this, I would say. Okay, now we come to number 58, which is the Presbyterians. This is the term generally given to followers of Calvin. Now, Calvin was a Frenchman who was not far from here. He studied law at university and he became a lawyer, a notary, they call it in French. He read the Gospels, he wanted to be a good Christian. He was very learned, he could read Greek and Latin, and he was even friendly with the Queen of France at that time, who was in Amboise. It was a Renaissance. He wanted a new form of Christianity that would try and be authentic to the original teachings of Jesus. And he thought it should be much more egalitarian. He felt that each community, each church should be able to elect its own pastors from among its congregation. So let's say here in Betet, there's 20 or 30 Christians that come together. They should decide among them who is the most learned, the wisest to lead them. And it shouldn't be appointed by some bishop in Limoges who lives 100 miles away and doesn't really know Betet. It should be one of us. And we'd be answerable to that, to the community. Now that sounds good in theory, and Calvin wrote this thing called the Institutes of Religion, which set out his ideas in the ideal church. He felt that in order to effect this Reformation, you would have to alter and change the way the Catholic Church operates. And of course the Catholics didn't like that. So basically they chased him out of France and he had to take refuge in Geneva in Switzerland. And he was given permission by the town council of Geneva to sort of reform the church. And, there are different views on Calvin. It's a very controversial figure. Some would say he did a very good job, and he reformed it, very well. He had to go away and come back a second time because the first time they thought he was a bit too much. He was trying to interfere in things like dancing and courtship and abolishing things like Christmas customs. He was trying to make everyone more holy, which is why we often use the term Puritan to talk about Calvinists. We want everyone to be pure, so anything that's slightly naughty you couldn't do if Calvin was in the room. And even if Calvin wasn't in the room, he had spies. He would go from house to house checking. Were you dancing on a Sunday? Were you playing chess on a Sunday? He felt that it was his duty to interfere in all the details of your life and to be a busybody and come spying and, had you had an affair with the maid? Well, if so, you had to get up at church and confess it publicly and say, I am a sinner before God, I kissed the maid, etc., etc. And some people thought this was going too far, enough of that. So they chased him out of Geneva. But unfortunately, he got back in. He came back, and he went to Strasbourg. He was reading the New Testament in depth, and then he was invited to return to Geneva and set up a college of pastors and doctors, and also a consistorial court of discipline, which became this kind of theocracy that imposed his church discipline on people. Now, the trouble was, it made Christianity quite extreme, quite strict. And I think its worst thing was when it started burning people, doing exactly the same thing that the Catholics had been doing. So there was not much real progress being made. And the burning of Civitas was the worst thing, in my opinion, because that meant Calvin was declaring war against freedom of thought. So philosophers like me would be chased out of town or burned at the stake. Discuss, So he founded a university, a theological academy. He was a clever man, but he wasn't that clever. There was another chap in Geneva at the same time, Sebastian Castillo, who was also a reformer, Italian, French, spoke many languages, read all this stuff, was a humanist, had dived into all the esoteric writings and everything, and was, I think, about 10 times cleverer than Calvin. And Calvin chased him out of town. He was jealous of him. And this, to me, is the mark of a sort of semi-literate, semi-educated scholar. They reach a certain plateau of knowledge and then they stop there as if, I know it all, I'm the top now. And then they stop anyone climbing further up the mountain. They say, no, this is as far as you can go, Calvinism, that's the end. No, it's not. It's just a little way station on the path to enlightenment. If, God forbid, if the whole world became Calvinist, what a boring place it would be, and how dreadful. The other thing about the Calvinists is when they went to America in New England as the Puritans, they took with them these very strict attitudes, which led to the Salem witchcraft trials, because what Calvinists don't like is paganism. That's not allowed. If you want to dance around a tree and take your clothes off at Beltane and make love to the maid, in the woods, that's witchcraft, and you're going to be burned at the stake for that. So the Calvinists brought with them to New England this very strict kind of Christianity. I don't think Jesus himself would have been comfortable. I think he'd be dancing around the Beltane fires myself. But no, these strict Calvinists, they went big time for burning and killing witches. And then that led to this whole America the Great, America the Beautiful, America the chosen nation that's going to conquer everyone and impose Americanism on you. It's really Calvinism we're looking at in its more dangerous aspect. There is a link between Calvin's ignorance and the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, which was Bush was being just a typical sort of, bigoted, religious, narrow-minded, let's go and kill the Muslims, with not a single thought in his brain about, well, actually, what's the Quran about? Maybe they're actually some kind of Christians. Shouldn't we be brothers? But anyway, so that's Calvin. And he died in 1564. His ideas spread like wildfire. They took off in Scotland with John Knox, which became a cradle for this extremist view. And he didn't like Mary Queen of Scots, who was a liberal Catholic, which I think is more to my flavour. He had, he wanted to impose this very strict sort of witch hunting attitude on Scotland, and that caused some trouble, right down to the current day. The ripples are still there. I've met Scottish witches that are still trying to get apologies out of the estate, for having their ancestors been burned and so on. It also caused trouble in the Dutch Reformed Church, which became Calvinist. And when the Dutch went to South Africa and took this Calvinism with them, they were able to turn it into a sort of racist doctrine that we, the white Calvinist people, are pure and saved. You, the black pagan people, you can just be our slaves. It was used as a justification for slavery, in fact, Calvinism, because I'm the holy one, I'm saved, and you're just a pagan guy, so I can use your labour. Well, that's, we've got to unthink all that stuff. So we have to unthink Calvinism, in my opinion, and the Christian church has quite a lot of unthinking to do, or rethinking, if we're going to try and get collective enlightenment instead of just enlightenment for our tribe, and all the rest of you can be damned to hell forever. That's a bit old-fashioned, I would say. Okay, so that's the Presbyterians, they're called. Next we come to, we're jumping down now to the last row, because the Christians come in two blocks on the periodic table. The last row starts with a Mormon church. Now this is an interesting one, the Mormons. They're the only sort of homegrown American church, founded by Joseph Smith in the 1800s, he was a young spiritual seeker. He was interested in the occult mysteries. He wanted to be a good Christian. He lived in upper New York State, not a very rich background, but not too poor. I mean, he was literate, he could read. He read the Bible through and through dozens of times. And he got very interested in the ancient world, archaeology, the mysteries. He dabbled in Freemasonry, his thought. And then he was visited by an angel. And this angel, I think was called Moroni, showed him where these golden tablets were buried in a hillside, and brought these golden tablets to him and gave him some scrying tool whereby he could translate them. Well, this is all quite exciting stuff. It's like, Raiders of the Lost Ark in New York, and what's not to love. So anyway, Joseph Smith, with a friend who trusted his word, although the friend never saw the gold tablets, by the way, and they vanished, they've never been found, of course, they transcribed a book called the Book of Mormon, dictated from these gold tablets. And this book is written like the Bible. It's got chapter and verse divisions, just like the Bible text. The books come with different names, dictated by this angel, Moroni. And it tells the story, apparently, of one of the Jewish tribes that emigrated to the New World at the time of Solomon by ship. So there was a tribe of good Jews living in America, in around New York and elsewhere around there, from about 1000 BC. And it tells their story. They have all these histories, battles, and good ones, bad ones, just like the Bible. Right? And then, at the time of Christ, because Christ is the King of the Jews and the Messiah of all the Jews, the risen Christ appears to the people of the American Jews like a heavenly Jesus appears and is seen. And some of them, the good ones, become good Christians. Others don't, and there's fights and it goes on. And eventually, it's all written down on the gold tablets for someone to find in the future. And that's what Joseph Smith discovers. Okay, now that book, the Book of Mormon, is believed to be literally true by, there's about 11 million Mormons at the moment on the earth, who will, every home will have a copy of that book. They'll study it, they'll do prayers every day for it, they know all the characters in the story, and there are Mormon churches in most American cities, many British cities, a few around Europe. There's one in Jerusalem opposite the Temple Mount. There's a lot of Mormons, and their story is quite interesting. Joseph Smith himself died. He was called a troublemaker and a fake and an imposter, and some people didn't believe a word he was saying. They thought he was a trickster and a rabble-rouser. Other people swore by him and said he's the new prophet. You know, if somebody turned up in the tech today saying they found these gold tablets up on the Pierre Montmartre, and this is telling the story of Gaul in the time of Christ, this is how we should behave. Personally, I'd want to see the tablets. I'd insist, because I'm a rational person. So, I think the jury's out. In my own research, the good news is that there's millions of people believe it, and there's these wonderful churches, and they seem to do, on the whole, fairly good work. Although there are some things about the theology that are a bit odd. They're very good on family genealogy, because they say that the Mormons have tried to find out everyone who's ever lived on Earth. Like, we have in our family tree thousands and thousands of ancestors. The Mormons say that if I consciously know the name of one of my ancestors and I baptize them retrospectively in the true Mormon church, they'll live with me forever in the Mormon heaven. Which I think will be a nice place. The Mormon heaven is great. Another feature of the Mormons that some people like is it's polygamous. You can have more than one wife. Joseph Smith thought this was a good idea. Had more than one wife. And down to recent times, the Mormons were able to have more than one wife. Although that's now been sort of changed, I think, because it doesn't fit with contemporary American ethics so much. Anyway, the bad news is that when I was researching all this on my spiritual journey and so on, I discovered that scholars have researched it and discovered that about 9/10 of the Book of Mormon appeared in a novel which was written about the same time and had come out a few years before the Book of Mormon. So it looks like, to use reason, it looks like Joseph Smith had got hold of that novel and copied whole bits of it and created this thing, the Book of Mormon, and got away with it. Because it's before the internet, you couldn't do checking, and so he just tomfooled everyone. And still, there's 11 million people that, I don't know, they're not allowed to listen to the fact of the novel. It's been scrubbed out of their history. But, I'm just saying as a philosopher that we ought to look for truth first and foremost, rather than being a this or a that. And if I was Leibniz, I'd say, let's open the debate, let's look at the novel if it's true, and then the Mormons can say, well, okay, it's true. Right, well, it was a good innings whilst it lasted, And that doesn't mean that everything the Mormons have ever taught is wrong or bad. It just means one has to balance these things in the light of truth. One of the good things they did is they did do this great trek when they left Nauvoo in Indiana, where Joseph Smith was killed, I believe, which had been their sanctuary, so in the Midwest. They then decided, to hell with it, they're going to persecute us, so let's go west. And they got in their wagon train and they crossed 1,000 miles to Utah. And they founded Salt Lake City in the middle of nowhere. There were just some Indian tribes. And they respected the Indians, they got on all right. And they created this whole new city called Salt Lake City in the middle of nowhere. And they turned it into fertile land, and they created the state of Utah, which they wanted to create a whole state called Deseret, which would be Nevada, Utah, and other states, but they only got Utah in the end. And, there's a university in Salt Lake City. They're quite clever people. Also, they did have some strong Masonic influences as well. I think Joseph Smith's, some of his ideas were sort of tingled with certain Masonic aspects as well. Right, so anyway, that's the Mormons. That's number